Great. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm very excited to hear from Teresa Johnson, class of 1985. And first I'll introduce her to everyone. I know some people are here who know her very well, but just so everyone knows, and then we'll get into what I think is going to be a great conversation about her work just from our meeting yesterday. I'm really excited about this talk. So thank you for being here. So Teresa is a partner at the law firm Arnold and Porter in San Francisco. And through her work, she focuses on board diversity, stakeholder capitalism, and other environmental, social, and governance issue matters, which are also considered ESG, which we'll refer to later as ESG. She is one of the founders of the firm's ESG practice and is the co-head of the firm's capital markets practice. She advises clients on securities transactions, compliance, and reporting matters. She's an officer of the Bar Association of San Francisco and is one of the leaders of the Legal Alliance for Reproductive Rights, which is a coalition among the Bar Association of San Francisco, the San Francisco City Attorney, and a large cohort of law firms, including Arnold and Porter, which coordinates providing pro bono legal assistance with the exercise in connection with the exercise of reproductive rights following the Dobbs decision. So thank you, Teresa, for being here tonight.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thrilled to be with the fellow Marlboro alums, and I am a proud member of the class of 1985. I imagine that I know Michelle's here, and I bet there are some other folks here as well. It's good to virtually see you.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'd first love for us to talk about your time at Marlboro. It's, what has brought us all together. We're all alums. And first, I'd love to hear from you. What were your interests at Marlboro on any given day? Where could someone find you as a student? What do you look back on like fondly from your time there?
I will say that I really loved my time at Marlboro. It's such a cliche, but I made friends there that have lasted a lifetime. And some of them are on the Zoom with me today, perhaps because we all went through adolescence and had made our questionable fashion choices together. Who knows? But we're all still very close, which is amazing. I started in the 7th grade and I went the whole way through, and I was the classic liberal arts person. I loved English and languages and history. I was in one of the first ancient history classes taught by Dr. Langdon, and one of the last English classes taught by Ms. Carnes. So we kind of bookended those two, landmark Marlboro teachers. I had lunch every day with my friends in the front bricks, and later in the gallery in the senior living room when we ascended to the lofty heights of being juniors and seniors. And in terms of extracurricular activities, for me, it was mostly sports. I played basketball and I was a swimmer. And I was the editor of the Ultraviolet in my senior year, which kind of teed me up to be on the newspaper then when I went to college.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. So that was a nice carry through. I love hearing people say front bricks. It's something that I fully forgot about in the past 13 years. And then someone just said it recently to me and it brought back this rush of memories and emotions. And I was so now I love to hear it because they don't call it that anymore. There's now a big crest.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a big crest at the entrance. And I think people call it let's meet at the crest, or they say something like that. But people who've been at Marlboro for a long time still all refer to it as the front brick. So that's nice.
Awesome.
So, on that note about joining the newspaper once you got to college, because of being on the UV at Marlboro, what were some other highlights or mentors, experiences, things that you can really call on that led you to the work that you do today?
Well, I think for me, the journey kind of, it started in college and on to law school. I went to college at Harvard and then I went to law school at Stanford. And in thinking about mentors, really my dad was a big role model for me. He was a lawyer and he had gone to Harvard and Stanford law school, and I really followed in his footsteps. He and my mom really valued education and instilled in me the importance and value of education and of giving back to the community. And when I was in college and in law school, I got involved in community activities. I did literacy training for adult learners, and I had a participated in a program where I visited a elderly shut-in for a while. I did pro bono work for disenfranchised folks when I was in law school. So I kind of began that process of being involved in community issues. When I started practicing, I began my career in Los Angeles, and there I shared a house with two friends from Marlboro, Michelle, who's on the Zoom, and Ann McIntyre, who may also be on the Zoom.
Yes.
And then I worked in London for a couple of years, and then I returned to San Francisco to practice in 1998, and I've been here ever since. And in terms of coming back to my mentorship and my dad, I think he was very involved in the legal community in Los Angeles, and that kind of inspired me to be involved in the legal world here. So as you mentioned, I've been part of the leadership of the Bar Association of San Francisco for a long time, and I'm the president-elect. So in 2024, I will be the president. So I'm gearing up for a very busy year at that point.
Oh, wow.
But you know, one thing I think that I'd also noted that really focused my attention on the need to be engaged was in 2004, when San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom announced plans to start marrying same-sex couples at City Hall. And so my partner and I lined up with many other couples, and we got married along with thousands of other folks in that very brief window of time. And I was really proud of being able to be part of that. It was something I really never expected was going to happen, or certainly not at that time. And then I was proud too that my law firm, which was called Howard Rice at the time, ended up representing the city and county of San Francisco on a pro bono basis in connection with the inevitable litigation that followed the 2004 marriages, in which the city eventually prevailed in the California Supreme Court in 2008. And so from then until the sad Prop 8 passed later in 2008, we had a window of time where there were a lot more marriages. And then, of course, we went to marriage equality in 2015. And so I would say that kind of really started my thinking about finding ways to be engaged in issues around equality and diversity, and using my legal skills to support those missions. And certainly my experience at Marlboro helped reinforce the importance of having women at the table and in the decision-making process, and especially in the corporate world where I practice law.
Absolutely. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a very clear explanation on how you have this focus on board diversity, which is the first thing I'd love for you to talk more about in your practice, is what this entails, what this consists of. I heard you talk recently on a podcast about how laws are changing in regard to board diversity and what's required. I think it's an interesting subject because, at least for maybe young people who are just starting to work at companies with boards, not really connected to the board in any way, because it could be their boss's 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 boss, but thinking about what the boards are talking about and what's required of them or asked of them to be mindful of. So I'd love for you to share more about board diversity and the work that you do around that.
Sure. So my legal practice focuses on corporate governance. And so maybe just stepping back to kind of set the table on what that means. So broadly speaking, corporations are owned by their shareholders, and the shareholders elect boards of directors who are charged with overseeing the corporation, and then boards appoint chief executive officers and other executives who run the corporation on a day-to-day basis. And the laws that govern corporations are under state law, where, for example, many corporations are organized in Delaware. That's pretty common. And then also for a publicly traded company where the shares are exchanged on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, they're also governed by the SEC and then by the rules of the exchange like NYSE or NASDAQ. So historically, boards of directors have been overwhelmingly filled with white men who tend to remain in their board seats for a long time. So the joke is that boards tend to be pale, male, and stale. So starting in the 2000s, regulators and thought leaders in Europe started talking about the need to get more women on corporate boards. And interestingly, Norway was the first country to pass a law in 2004 that required a minimum number of women on boards, and other European countries followed suit. So the idea that a more diverse board with the benefit of a broader set of perspectives and a broader experience makes better, less risky, more informed decisions has been supported in a number of studies, and it's gained traction now with a number of the biggest mainstream market players, such as investment banks like Goldman Sachs and institutional investors like BlackRock. And California has led the way in pushing for board diversity by adopting laws in 2018 and 2020, which required a minimum number of women and then a minimum number of members of underrepresented groups, meaning minorities and folks in the LGBTQ+ community, to be on the boards of publicly traded corporations headquartered in California. And so for me, when California kind of jumped on the board diversity bandwagon, it seemed like it was time to make that a personal and professional focus. And I started following the issue and I started writing and speaking about it. And that really spawned some amazing connections. A case in point is that through being involved in board diversity issues, I reconnected with a college friend of mine who had joined a few corporate boards after she retired from Goldman Sachs. And she then found that she had peers who similarly were women who had left the banking world and were joining corporate boards and wanted to have a community to be able to talk about best practices and discuss innovations and new developments in board governance, and didn't feel like they really had a place to do that. And so she started an organization that does that. And through that connection, I got connected to this network of amazing women board members, and I'm serving now as an expert in residence for them, and that's just been super cool. One thing I will note in terms of talking about this practice area is that when I started doing this work, some of my colleagues questioned whether it was really a good idea for me to be advocating for board diversity and speaking publicly and positively about it. Because as a career matter, I advise boards, and it's possible that certainly some folks may not agree with that. And for me, the answer was, this is really just the right thing to do. This is what we should be doing. This is where we are today, and and that's that. And I really haven't had a much negative that has transpired from that, notwithstanding those warnings. And I would say generally that my experience at Marlboro certainly helped my perspective in focusing on board diversity as an important thing. And now we're starting to see, unfortunately, some pushback on board diversity. The California laws were overturned in court. Other board diversity laws have been the subject of legal challenges, and most of that is coming from conservative activists. Interestingly, the same person, the same individual who brought the case that's currently before the US Supreme Court challenging affirmative action also is challenging the California board diversity laws and the NASDAQ board diversity laws. So what I think that illustrates is that our national discourse is getting increasingly polarized between blue and red, Democratic and Republican, liberal and conservative, and even subjects that are relatively dry, like the composition of boards, are kind of getting caught up in those culture wars.
How much, despite these laws being overturned, how have you seen boards who will continue to practice the same, approach to diversity on their board because they feel it's the right thing to do because you've advised them, or because they've already felt that way and that's why you work with them? Like, who do you feel like a majority of these boards, at least you've worked with, will continue to have this practice despite a law requiring them to do so?
I think they will. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen is that, and it was known from the very beginning when the California laws were signed into effect, that they would be subject to legal challenge. And what's been great to see is that, notwithstanding that, the number of women on California-based public companies has tripled since the laws went into effect. The representation of minorities has improved strongly, not quite as much as women, unfortunately, but it's on the path. And I think it's also notable that in addition to these laws, there's also market forces, meaning big institutional investors, big investment banks, that are taking the position that they are encouraging and to some degree will only do business with and support companies that have sufficiently diverse boards. So yeah, I think it's really going to continue to happen. That said, we are seeing certainly a pushback on board diversity and ESG broadly, which I know we'll talk about in a minute. And I think that's kind of a competing force. So, watch this space, but I think women on boards is going to continue to stay, and hopefully will continue to grow.
Yes, me too. So yeah, your ESG practice, let's talk about that. I think that's something, at least for me, I'm not familiar with it. And I heard, on the same podcast, you talk about how it can be very specific to where you're living because of the nature of ESG. In California, you're talking about wildfires and you're talking to wineries, and that's very specific to this state. But if you could talk broadly, like across the US, what an ESG practice might look like, and then also specifically to you and your, experience working with organizations on this matter.
So ESG and board diversity is kind of a subset, essentially one aspect of the broader topic of ESG, and it's something that gets talked about a lot in the media today. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance, and it's essentially a movement that's kind of pulling the business and legal world forward into taking into account the effects of climate change and social policy and inclusivity in business. So it's kind of like looking at capitalism with a wider lens. It's not looking purely at a corporation in terms of, well, how much money can you make in the short term, but more how its business affects the environment and society, and maybe taking a longer term view and how that lays into or is built into making decisions. So as you mentioned, in terms of ESG considerations in the practice that I have where I'm advising California clients, wildfires is a big deal. And so that has a big effect on companies that are deciding whether they're going to pursue business opportunities in areas where wildfires are a significant risk. Wineries in Napa and Sonoma are great examples of that. So we all are aware of the terrible wildfires that have happened in the course of the last several years, and a number of those pretty much decimated the grape crop, either through burning or through smoke taint for those years. And that had an enormous effect on the business of those wineries, and as a ripple effect, has made it very difficult for businesses, wineries and other businesses operating in those areas to get insurance, which is another huge problem. So one concern around that is thinking about how to manage and deal with those risks. Similarly, if you're in the business of working with utilities, you may have the same considerations where doing business with utilities carries extra risk because your work, whatever you're doing, could arguably contribute to the cause of a wildfire. So for boards, you have to think really hard about whether it's worthwhile pursuing those kinds of opportunities, and are there things you can do to try to mitigate those risks. Other businesses in different parts of the country, for example, are grappling with climate change in the context more of rising sea levels, and thinking about whether they have to move their operations or their factories to higher ground, basically, because they're at risk from rising sea levels or hurricanes, that they're going to suffer damage, and the same kinds of insurance challenges plague them too. So there's a ton of examples of all this kind of stuff. One thing that we're all probably seeing is the effect of ESG in a lot of different places. Like when you go to the grocery store, whether you're buying a car, whether you're picking something to invest, a fund to invest in your 401k, everybody's touting their sensitivity to ESG, and that carries legal risk too, because if a company overpromises, let's say, about its commitment to reach net zero goals or to invest in disenfranchised communities or something else, the SEC and other regulators and even private litigants will hold their feet to the fire. And so a big part of what I and others in our ESG practice do is to counsel companies as to how to be accurate and not overpromise on ESG goals. And that's a really important area. You've probably seen a lot of discussion in the media about greenwashing, and those are the kinds of things that come up.
I find that so interesting that your work can very clearly bleed into like the marketing team or the social media person and manager at a company, you know, like making sure that the captions are and the, you know, packaging and all of these very, very like smaller details compared to what you're dealing with, which are these very much like bigger, you know, issues of this, where a company is going to be based out of or how they're going to source their products, and all these things can get, you know, brought down to this level where, yeah, you can ensure that they're not misleading their customers or their clients or whoever, you know, is using their product or service. So I find that so interesting.
Exactly
And
right. And there's like the whole pushback too is going on with that as well. So we're seeing states challenging ESG focused funds and challenging the making ESG a priority on the theory that that's bringing political views into the investment process, and that that's not something they support. And somewhat, you know, similarly, this kind of polarization in our political and cultural landscape is defining this kind of space too.
have you found that any of your clients, as you're talking about these like these issues, that they then find themselves wanting to invest beyond, like, to help combat climate change because, or maybe make, you know, serious changes so they can have a more sustainable future, because maybe their current practices are not sustainable? You know, when does it become this larger conversation, I guess, about things beyond what their core business might be, I guess, if that makes sense.
It's something I think that many companies are thinking about. And to give you an illustration, when you think about carbon emissions, they're often characterized in terms of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And scope 1 would be essentially the direct carbon emissions from a business that you know, it's, let's say that it's a fossil fuel manufacturer, and it's the direct emissions that fossil fuel manufacturer is creating. But then you also want to look at scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, and those are more tangential. Those can relate to things like, you know, well, what about the emissions of businesses in our supply chain? What about the emissions that are associated not so much with our core business, but with things that are part of our business, but not necessarily, you know, the widgets we make? What about things relating to traveling, or, you know, our executives traveling to other to visit other factories or other parts of our operations? Are they flying private? Do they, you know, what are the carbon emissions associated with that? And so it's kind of this concept of looking at your carbon footprint in a broader perspective that really is something that companies are now thinking about, and thinking about how they can address. And there's proposed disclosure rules that the SEC is considering that would require companies to include in the public reports they have to file with the SEC detailed descriptions of all of these kinds of emissions. And I think sunshine has a big effect on decision making. And so to the extent that there's more disclosure required about the big picture of all of the emissions that, you know, for example, your company is involved in, that's likely to have an effect on the company's decision making around, well, how can we reduce those emissions? What steps can we take to be more responsible to the climate?
That's great. So even if it's because they're being forced to do it, at least there is a benefit to it in the long term, which is great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that in a variety of different areas, and businesses up and down the spectrum are starting to think about that and report about it. We as a law firm are being asked by our clients to talk about the firm's carbon footprint, and I'm sure that is happening in businesses all over the place.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I'd love to talk about the Legal Alliance for Reproductive Rights. I think it's such an incredible thing that you are one of the leaders of. And first, you know, can you share about how it all came together? Because I know you briefly shared with me yesterday that it was very quick and pretty unbelievable, like how these law firms and the San Francisco city attorney came together to make this all happen. But I'd love for you to share, how it all really did come together so quickly.
So it was pretty exciting. It was quite a flurry of activity in those first few days. So as we all know, just setting the stage, the Roe v. Wade is the Supreme Court decision decided in 1973 that established or memorialized a constitutional right to choose, a right to seek abortions. And that has been the law of the land since 1973. In May of this year, a Supreme Court decision was leaked. The case was argued in the fall, and it was expected to be coming out towards the end of the Supreme Court's term. But this is the first time that a Supreme Court decision has been leaked in, I think, a very, very long time. And the leaked Dobbs decision essentially showed that the court was planning to completely overturn Roe v. Wade. And that set off just a firestorm of activity. And when the Dobbs decision was leaked, that very night, we started texting. I started texting with my colleagues at the Bar Association about what we could do. And this was really a time to meet the moment, to get on board, and to not delay. So we immediately started talking with the San Francisco city attorney, and those discussions gave rise to the plan to put together a coalition of attorneys to provide pro bono help to women and pregnant people and to providers and supporters, with the expectation that the fall of Roe was going to trigger an avalanche of people traveling to California seeking to exercise their reproductive rights. So essentially, it's a public-private collaboration to bring together our strengths and resources and to try to ensure that people don't have to put their personal freedoms online just to exercise a constitutional right. So we put our heads and our Rolodexes together, and we started pulling together a dream team of national and local law firms, big firms, all the way down to criminal defense boutiques. We announced the launch of the Legal Alliance for Reproductive Rights on June 1st at a press conference on the steps of City Hall with the San Francisco city attorney and the head of Planned Parenthood California and a bunch of us lawyers. We started with a coalition of 20 law firms. We've now grown to 70. We've had a virtual training session for hundreds of attorneys in July with presenters from Planned Parenthood, If, When, How, the Center for Reproductive Rights, and other leading nonprofits in the reproductive justice community. So it was super exciting. We were really the first organization of our kind that was formed in the wake of Dobbs, and it was really heartening to be able to do something affirmative and positive in the wake of such a really depressing decision. And it's the work of LARR is continuing to grow, and since the time of the launch, we've helped connect dozens of providers and funders and those involved in seeking reproductive justice with pro bono legal support.
It's amazing. I want everyone to know about this and that you did this. It's just so incredible. So since June, you mentioned you've connected people. What else have you seen happen, I think, come out of this? And, you talked about how this is really, it's cutting edge legal issues coming out of this because how technology has changed since the early 70s, the trigger laws that went into effect that could be very easily outdated compared to the world we live in now, that now they're in effect. This is, I feel like, bringing on these cases that could have very, very interesting arguments. So I'd love for you to kind of shed some light on that and what's, just what has happened since June and the formation of this.
So this has really prompted an avalanche of undocumented, essentially, we are in uncharted waters in a lot of ways in terms of the legal issues. And I won't bore everyone with all of the gory details of the legal issues, but maybe to just sort of quickly set the stage. So when Roe came down, what that meant was then that resulted in kind of activating trigger bans in a number of states. So before Roe was decided in 1973, most states did not permit abortions. And so when Roe was decided, that had the effect of making it constitutional across the land. And with the fall of Roe, that triggered these trigger ban laws in many states, some of which predated Roe, some of which were adopted after Roe, kind of on a symbolic basis, but now obviously they're having an effect. And so today, abortions are almost entirely unavailable in about 15 states. There are other states where Florida and Arizona, for example, have 15-week bans. To talk a little bit about some of the things that didn't exist at the time of Roe. Today, most abortions are done using pills. They're medication abortions. And so in addition to the restrictions on performing abortions in states, other restrictions limit this more modern form of abortion care. And so a number of states prohibit sending medication abortion by mail. Other states prohibit providing abortion services via telemedicine. Other states impose liability on supporters of patients for aiding and abetting. So the restrictions are really designed to make it very difficult to obtain abortions if you're in a state that bans them. On the flip side, we have states like California, which I'll refer to as access states, that have provided access to abortion for pregnant patients and are providing protections for providers and supporters. And so we have this kind of two very different approaches where we have states that are making it very easy and enshrining the right to seek an abortion, and then other states where it is really illegal, essentially. And not only that, but then there are legal penalties for people who are trying to perhaps support, whether it's through logistical assistance or financial assistance, to essentially make it very difficult for them to do that and to run the risk that they will have legal liabilities as a result of that. One novel legal issue that we're seeing is obviously privacy. So since 1973, one of the biggest changes that's happened is we all now carry around devices that contain a lot of information about our location data, our personal messaging, perhaps even our medical data is stored digitally, and that information may be available for subpoena. There's a federal law called HIPAA that we all probably are familiar with, that when you go to the doctor's office, you sign a privacy waiver and so forth, and that's because of HIPAA, which generally protects privacy for medical records. However, HIPAA contains an exclusion for legally required disclosures like subpoenas. And so people are concerned about the risks, and these are, again, relatively uncharted waters in terms of how this is going to play out in the post-Roe world. But to what extent companies that store digital health information, for example, can successfully fight a subpoena from another state, from a banned state, is a matter of question. California, for example, as an access state, has adopted laws that provide that those kinds of subpoenas are not enforceable in California. But whether California, the effectiveness of that and where the data is stored, all can have a big effect on whether that data could be obtainable via a subpoena. And data on your cell phone, like a period tracker app, for example, is not protected by HIPAA, so that is even more subject to being subpoenaed or gathered.
I think what's most interesting coming out of all of this is realizing how so many people know so little, and I'll say men who don't have female reproductive organs know so little about pregnancy and reproduction overall. And something that we talked about was how doctors now who have an oath to help people and make sure however they can keep them alive and safe medically, are now having to call attorneys and delay care. Sometimes that can be very emergent, and I feel like that's a result of people not understanding how just the breadth of this word, of the meaning of abortion and what it entails, and a wanted pregnancy versus an unwanted pregnancy, and so many other issues that can come with pregnancy, whether it's planned or not. So I guess my question is about how the Legal Alliance has supported medical providers and maybe pharmacists and health providers, I guess, overall, since June, specifically, because I find that so unfortunate that they're literally not able to do their job anymore. They're fearful of doing their job.
It's a huge issue, no question. We've advised doctors who are considering, for example, the issues around treating patients who may have come to them from a neighboring state, and whether they're permitted to do that, and whether they're putting their license at risk by doing so. One of the issues that comes up in this context, which is kind of a scary thing, is the notion of the criminalization of pregnancy. So folks may have heard of the notion of fetal personhood laws, which essentially provide that people or fetuses have the rights of humans and are treated as humans under the law. And so you may have seen like the news reports about Georgia allowing people to take tax deductions for fetuses. And there was a report about a woman in Texas who tried to drive in the HOV lane because she was pregnant and claimed that meant she had 2 passengers in the car. So there are those kinds of things going on, but the more sort of sinister part of it is that fetal personhood laws, which exist on the books in a number of states, can affect both and can have the effect of resulting in problematic outcomes for not only for unwanted pregnancies, which is what we all usually think about when we're considering the loss of the right of choice, but also wanted pregnancies, to the extent that those wanted pregnancies experience complications, whether it's an ectopic pregnancy or something else, or whether the worst outcomes, whether there's a stillbirth or a miscarriage. And there are women who have been prosecuted in some states, including in California, I'm sorry to say, for stillbirths where drugs were found in their systems, even if there was no causal link between the drugs and the stillbirth. And it's also true that miscarriages may be subject to reporting, as there can be very little clinical difference between a medication abortion that has complications and a natural miscarriage. And so the result may be that patients choose not to seek care out of fears that they'll be the subject of inquiries or prosecutions. And it just adds to the horrific circumstances of a miscarriage or a stillbirth, the fact that you have to then worry about legal liability. And then to your point, Emily, about the doctors and the life of the mother exceptions, there too, it's lawyers are getting involved in medical treatment decisions. Doctors are in states where there is an abortion ban and the only exception is for the life of the mother, are literally having to call lawyers and describe the symptoms of the mother and make a decision with input from a lawyer about at what point they can treat her and perform an abortion. And the fact that lawyers are effectively in the treatment room is really just a terrible outcome. That is, we have no business being there under any circumstances.
Yeah, it seems like it's a result of people having a part in this decision making who, like I said, just don't understand what they're making decisions on.
Yeah, and doctors are at risk because they have to worry about licensing. They have to worry about whether the actions they're taking are going to subject them to challenges to their licenses. And I think what we are seeing given how strongly held views are on both sides of this issue, and with respect to the anti-abortion community, there's been a focus on going after doctors who are performing abortions and raising questions about their licenses, and so they have reason to be concerned.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, when people, because of a personal opinion, can have influence over your career and the rest of your life, and your ability to make a living, that's terrifying. So I'd love to know, though, I mean, you said a lot of good has come out of this, and I think with the board diversity and ESG matters, we talked about how there is good coming out of this. So I would love to end it on that note. and like what you have seen in people mobilizing, or wins that you've seen, something, you know, positive that has come out of this, because I know it's been, I think, just very jarring to a lot of people, and can feel very like scary, and you're unsure of how to kind of navigate things. So I'm curious what you have seen that's positive that's come out of it.
Well, I think the positive things are I'll give one very concrete example, the midterms. So we just had a midterm election. Historically, midterms result in a big wave for the party that is currently not in power. So typically, if there's a Republican in the White House and controlling Congress, then the midterms result in a big Democratic wave, and and vice versa. And that's been the case for a long time. And this year, we did not see that. We did not see the red wave, and we saw, yesterday's Georgia runoff is an indication of that too. And I think that a big part of the reason that we didn't see that red wave is because of people realizing that the significance of the Dobbs decision, and that it's bigger than Republican versus Democrat, that it's about keeping politics out of personal health decisions. And so I think the positive thing that I take from this is the sense of empowerment, and the sense of being involved, that getting involved in an issue that where something has happened that you don't agree with, that you see as an injustice. It's all too easy to kind of get caught up in our day-to-day lives and focus on the deadlines we have and the things we have to do every day. But it's been a real reminder to me, this experience, about the power we have, particularly as women, to affect change. And we can do that on an individual level. And we are even more powerful when we get together. And so, the experience I've seen with LARR, which has been a fantastic coalition. And one thing I think that's really been telling to me and very heartening is that whenever we have had matters come in, we always have way more takers, way more people interested in helping and getting involved in those matters than we do matters. We have more demand than supply to some degree, and that's really amazing to see. I think seeing the process of people getting engaged and getting involved is maybe the silver lining out of this.
That's amazing. That's very nice to hear. So, just to bring it back to you, these are big issues that can be very heavy, very emotionally and politically charged. And how do you kind of like center yourself outside of work? How do you, because, obviously it's very clear that you care so much about the work that you do, and that's why you do it. But I can imagine sometimes it's hard to like find that boundary between like your personal beliefs and the work you're doing. And so I'm curious how you navigate that. And then also just how you kind of like protect yourself against, in terms of like, being just overwhelmed by the work that you do sometimes.
I would say that I think my training as a lawyer is very helpful. My job as a lawyer is to assess issues and to understand them and advise on risks, and to advocate emphatically on behalf of clients. And as part of that, you have to keep your eyes on the prize and be effective and persuasive, and know that a determined effort is the thing that's going to carry the day. And I would also say, and I'm aware of this, and I think my experience at Marlboro has helped me be focused on the fact that women have a lot more power than I think we realize we have, and so to some degree in the big world, we get the unfortunate and unjustified stereotype of being deemed to be emotional, and we're more emotional than men, and so I think it's particularly important as women, and when advocating for issues that are deemed women's issues, to really try to walk that line of being emphatic and forceful, but not seeming emotional. It's that tricky balance between being empathetic and involved, and at the same time, keeping your head pretty clear. I won't say that it's always easy, But it is something that I keep in mind, and it helps to have a spouse and to have wonderful friends like my friends from Marlborough and colleagues to talk to things, to talk about these issues with, and to blow off steam. That's the way we all get through difficult things.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I will open it now to anyone here who has any questions. Okay, so we have one from Samantha Sewell. And she said, thank you for all of your amazing work you've done and for sharing it with us. You sort of touched on this, but what can she do, we all do, to support reproductive rights, having individuals with their medical advisors make these decisions? So I guess what work can we be doing to support this?
Thank you, Samantha. That's an amazing question. So I think the number one thing to do is to vote in every election, vote on everything. It really, really matters, and being engaged in the legislative process, because I think that this issue in particular, I mean, there's going to be a lot of blocking and tackling that's done in the courts as we work through bans and so forth, but a lot of the new decision making is going to be in the legislatures. The other thing I would say is that it's important to support reproductive justice organizations, Planned Parenthood, the Center for Reproductive Rights, If, When, How, the Lawyering Project. They're all amazing organizations. I'd also give a particular shout out for abortion fund aggregators. The National Network of Abortion Funds is a great one. And what they do is they provide essential financial support for patients seeking abortion. And they are working to try to figure out how they can provide support for patients in banned states, which is difficult, it's not impossible these days. But that's a huge part of it. I was on a panel recently with the president of Planned Parenthood in San Francisco, and she was telling me about the experience they're having in having patients come from other states. And she talked about one patient who had taken a $1,500 Uber ride to get to California from her home state, because that's the only way she could do it. And thoughtfully and thankfully, Planned Parenthood was able to cover those costs for her. But that's a good example of the kinds of costs that people are having to bear. And I think it's also worth being mindful of the fact that the people who are most affected by the loss of Roe are people who are generally of limited means, people from disenfranchised communities, communities of color. And so for them, the cost of traveling to another state to get an abortion may be impossible, or for a whole host of reasons. And so making donations, providing financial support is a great way to try to help bear that burden.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely say, the people who are making these decisions at the top are never going to be limited in their access to whatever they need. And so they're not considering those people that the group of people that you're talking about who are going to be the most impacted by this. Not only in their limitations to access, but of course, the financial burden of this can be so great. It's unbelievable. So if no one has any other questions, we have, I think, another question. Okay, yeah. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, thank you so much for speaking with us and the work that you're doing. I have a question as someone interested in doing work similar to what you're doing. Do you have any advice for a 1L, which I think means first year law?
First year law student, yep.
Okay, applying to firms for the summer to figure out how to tell the difference between firms that just say that they care about pro bono practices and those where pro bono is actually an important part of their firm culture, and where associates and partners are actively encouraged to engage in that work.
That's an excellent question too. So I think that to learn about that, the best places to look would be to look at the American Lawyer usually publishes a study or a set of articles about firms' commitment to pro bono, and if you can look at that, that's a good third-party indication of the amount of time that firms spend doing pro bono. We all really focus on that. I think each firm is different in its commitment to pro bono. My own firm, for example, has a stringent requirement that every lawyer at the firm, no matter how senior, has to perform at least 20 hours of pro bono work every year, and many of us do a whole lot more than that. But I think to assess that kind of the firm's commitment, I try to look at the American Lawyer for a third-party resource, and then I would talk as you're talking with people at the firm, as you're going through interviews, ask them about what kind of pro bono work they do, and just as the individuals that you're talking with, and that will, I think, give you a good perspective on how much the firm is really committed to pro bono. And to the extent that you're particularly interested in reproductive rights, there are a number of firms that are very active in reproductive rights. There's the firms that are involved in LARR are all committed to reproductive rights. I don't know where you are, but in Southern California, there's a similar organization called the Legal Alliance for Reproductive Justice, and a number of firms are part of that. So in doing your due diligence as you're considering firms to interview with, you could look to see whether they are involved in reproductive rights activities. And you're welcome to reach out to me if you'd like to talk about any of the firms. My email is on the firm website.
And does LARR have a website with the list of firms involved?
We do. If you go to the www.sfbar.org, that's the Bar Association of San Francisco's website, and then on that there's a LARR. I think if you do /LARR, there's a page for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Teresa. It's clear all of your work has such an impact in so many different areas, but there's this incredible connection between all of it. And I just thank you for all the hard work that you do. It's been so wonderful talking to you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This was a great conversation, and it'll be available on the Marlboro YouTube channel and on the Aiming High page within the alumni tab of the Marlboro website. So anyone who missed it or anyone you want to share it with, the link will go live there by Friday. So thank you, Teresa.
Outstanding. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'm thrilled to be back again with the Marlboro group. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great night.
Thanks all.
Bye.